Hello and welcome to Hot Topic, the second edition in this series, and I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by Martin Vickers, Member of Parliament for Cleethorpes and Immingham, and in the Conservative interest, first elected in 2010, Martin.
Yes.
And you've been re-elected twice now.
Yep.
You're an old veteran, really, aren't you?
Oh, well, I'm certainly old.
How did you do? You got 21.7% in this general election earlier this year. That's 10,400. Is that better or worse than your previous records?
Oh, that's much better, and the most satisfying thing was that I got 57% of the total vote, so I had an overall majority, which is always gives you a sense of satisfaction.
You've got that magical 50%.
Yeah.
Why is it when the Conservatives did so badly, and I know that I'm flattering you by this question, but why is it when the Conservatives did so badly, so much less well than expected in this general election, Cleethorpes and Immingham are really keen on you?
Well, it would be nice to think that they're satisfied with the job I'm doing, but I think more seriously, I have tried to articulate the sort of consensus of views within the constituency, and also argue constantly for more resources into the area, be an ambassador for the area. I'm from Cleethorpes, I know the area, I don't need any help and guidance from polls in order to tell me what the people think. I'd like to think that just by having lived here all my life, I've got a feel for the area and, as I say, can articulate people's views.
No point in doing a post-mortem from the Conservative point of view of the general election. It was clearly disastrous, really. Why?
Well, yes, I mean, it was a complete and utter disaster for a whole series of reasons, I think. Our manifesto didn't help, but also the way we did not speak about the successes that we've had. We failed to remind people that the country was in it was an economic basket case in 2010, and that it was the Cameron governments that had brought us out of that. And yes, of course, there are always demands on the extra budget. We all want more money spending in our area or our particular area of concern. But on the whole, the government had steered a pretty good course through the difficulties.
There's also a peculiarity in the voting system, isn't there, in that the national vote, the number of votes for Conservative candidates, was fairly healthy. But it's our first past the post voting system, which we voted to keep in 2011 in a referendum,
yes.
That has distorted the representation in the House of Commons.
Well, as I saw Andrew Marr remind Tony Blair on TV some weeks ago, Theresa May actually polled more than he did in 1997 when he walked off with a 164 majority. And yes, there are peculiarities, but we have 650 by-elections, and that's the beauty of the system in actual fact, because usually it creates a positive result, and you have this direct contact between the individual representative and the people that he or she represents.
Okay, well, that's the usual justification, even contrary.
Well, it's a very good justification. The other thing is, actually...
I wasn't saying it wasn't, Martin. I was just saying that I heard it before.
The other thing is that there is people can see a direct connection between voting and the outcome of the election. We had the German elections a week ago, and it's going to be 3 or 4 months before a new government is formed. We have an election on Thursday, and if there's going to be a change of government, as there was when Tony Blair came to power, for example, is on the steps of Downing Street at 6 o'clock the following morning. People can see that they have made a change.
Mrs May now has no majority. It's a minority government. A couple of people having a bad dose of flu, and inevitably in Parliament. I'd say this without wishing to be horrible about it, but there's always a few deaths during any Parliament. When's the next general election going to be? Because she only has to lose a vote.
Well, it's not quite as simple as that. I mean, she can lose a vital vote and then go back the following day, and she would get a support for a motion of confidence. And equally, if there are some very contentious votes, she could do what John Major did with the Maastricht vote and say, just that, I'm coming back tomorrow, it's the same motion, but it is a motion of confidence, and if we lose, I resign. So that inevitably pulls the troops together, and yes, she could lose some votes, but she won't lose a vote of confidence. Not in particular, not while she's got the DUP support.
Now, you bring up the DUP. This is the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland. I've heard them referred to as the Protestant Taliban before now. They have some pretty distasteful views. If I can just have they have been in the past, not now, associated with paramilitary forces, the Third Force, Ulster Resistance. They still now advocate the teaching of creationism in schools in Northern Ireland.
I'm not sure that's party policy. There might be an individual who does.
They have said that it is consistent with party policy, is their phrase. They don't want to have same-sex marriage rights and equal marriage rights between same sexes. Back in the 70s and 80s, they ran a campaign with a rather colourful title, Save Ulster from Sodomy. Sammy Wilson, who's one of their members of parliament, said last year that he endorsed a view of a member of the audience on a BBC programme saying that Brexit would mean that they could get the ethnics out of Northern Ireland. These are a pretty distasteful bunch of people to be associated with, aren't they?
Well, there's certainly some views amongst those which I couldn't possibly subscribe to, but the reality is, of course, they are the elected representatives of the people of Northern Ireland, and many of them with very large majorities, it has to be said. And in respect of some of the things which might not have mass appeal on this side of the Irish Sea, they do seem to resonate with the people they represent.
Are you happy then that the 56 million odd people who live on the island of Great Britain having their policies changed by the vote of the 3 or 4 million people who live in Northern Ireland?
Well, I'm not sure that they're having their votes changed. What they've got is...
Their government is dependent upon the goodwill of those people.
It's for confidence and supply, to give it the technical term. In other words, they would support the government in ensuring the budget gets through and in a motion of confidence. So that's not necessarily endorsing any of the policies in any shape or form.
What's it like? I mean, it must be a little uncomfortable sitting on those green leather benches when you know that you're having to at least be agreeable and accommodating to people from this really, in the tradition of English politics, quite alien party.
Well, most of them are perfectly agreeable. Most socialists are perfectly agreeable. I get on fine with many of them, but violently disagree with them when it comes to issues of policy.
We're going to have to move on to the cost of this agreement with the DUP. £1 billion that wouldn't previously have been spent on Northern Ireland, suddenly, very quickly, after the general election, seems to be invested in Northern Irish infrastructure and various other things. That's just a bung, isn't it?
Well, at least you've put it in its correct form. It means much of the media has sort of been advocating as if it were going into the pockets of the DUP members. In actual fact, what it means is that £1 billion more, as indeed you said, will be spent on projects in Northern Ireland during the next 3 or 4 years than would have been.
But it's
not extra money. Sadly, it means that other constituencies will have that bit less to spend.
But it is cause and effect, isn't it? The £1 billion was to buy the alliance with the DUP.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, I hope that you're as frank when you're sitting around one day when the day comes that you're sitting around the cabinet table.
That is the reality. They're not the cabinet table, by the way. I have no wish to sit around the cabinet table.
Well, I was promoting you there. We're going to have to move on to Brexit. The election was there to give Mrs May a mandate to negotiate Brexit from a powerful position. That's why she called it, and she thought she was complacent about Jeremy Corbyn losing it.
Yeah.
And she's now in an extremely weak position around that negotiating table, is she not?
Well, I'm not sure that the Europeans would have taken any different an approach had she been elected with a thumping majority. The reality is, at the moment, Monsieur Barnier has been given a brief by the Council of Ministers, which basically says be as tough as possible every time. But the nature of negotiations is that one side puts forward something, the other side says, oh no, that's not going far enough. That's what negotiations happen, and we're now having this continual commentary and speculation about what is or more than likely isn't happening. And the impression is also given that David Davis pops over there for 2 or 3 days once a month, and that's it. Hundreds of civil servants are meeting their opposite numbers in the Commission and going through endless rules, regulations and legislation to piece everything together so that there can be a smooth transition.
Brexit Bulldog Davis, I've heard him referred to. I don't know if that's meant quite ironically. The timetable there, when you say to civil servants and diplomats are talking all the time, really effectively less than a year of negotiating time.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, this tends to get lost in some of the coverage. When we talk about transition periods, that quite rightly annoys people who voted to leave. What they want to see is a clean Brexit with the main propositions
We'll
dealt
have to talk about that transition time after the break, Martin.
Right.
So sorry. Join me again in a couple of minutes. Welcome back to Hot Topic, and I'm still with Martin Vickers, Conservative Member of Parliament for Cleethorpes and Immingham. Martin, we interrupted ourselves there talking about the possibility of a transition time after the actual date of Brexit in March 2019. You, as a Brexiteer, presumably resist the idea of there being any sort of slow transition coming out of the European Union.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I think the important thing is that I and other people who voted to leave don't want to see an extended transition when it comes to the main sort of planks of the EU. We don't want oversight of the European Court. We want an end to free movement, and we want to be free to negotiate our trading arrangements with other nations. And those three things have got to happen very, very soon after the day that we leave. People are not going to get too het up about the fact that it might take 3 years in order to put a new computer system in order to exchange, I don't know, documentation about some sort of technical paperwork to do with import and export. But the issues that they felt strongly about and which resulted in the leave vote, we've got to get over very quickly, and certainly anything that stretches it beyond a year, to my way of thinking, is very unsatisfactory.
It's going to be a shock, though. It's going to be a shock to the economy to find ourselves suddenly trading without this freedom of movements and services within the European Union, possibility of tariffs coming down, or trading on World Trade Organization rules. And that's going to be, you're describing a very sudden movement from the gentle free trade within the European Union to a barrier going down the North Sea and the English Channel.
You know, the reality is that we have a trading deficit with the EU. They get more. The other 27 countries get more benefit out of it collectively than the UK does, and eventually it will dawn on everyone that the clock is ticking, time is running out, and it's mutually beneficial to get an agreement. And that will come at a political level. Mr. Barnier and Juncker and all these people will be cast to one side at some point, and people like Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron and one or two others will realise that the clock is ticking, it's 5 to midnight, we've got to get this sorted.
The three issues that are on the table at the moment, the EU doesn't want to talk about being in the single market or a customs union until the three issues of the Northern Irish border, which is not really any of our business here on the Humber, and the position of EU citizens in the UK and the UK citizens in the EU, and of course the Brexit divorce bill, as it were. Last time we were talking, we were speculating about numbers for the Brexit divorce bill. Mrs. May, in her speech in Florence, hometown of Niccolo Machiavelli, mentioned £20 billion. £20 billion is about 3, 4, 5 weeks UK government spending. If that was all, if I had income of 4 or 5 weeks is what I had to give up to pay off a divorce bill, I'd be a very happy ex-husband.
Yes, I can understand that, but the reality is, of course, politics enter it, and £20 billion is an awful lot of money, and people, voters, are not going to be very happy about it, and quite rightly so. I think there are legitimate reasons that we should, of course, pay into systems. We've got people who are getting EU pensions, many of them British citizens because they've worked for the Commission or whatever. Clearly, we have an obligation to pay our share of the pension bill. But when you start talking about access to the single market, well, fine, but as I said, they've got a trade deficit. What about them paying us for access to our market?
A matter of EU citizens in the UK, you'd like to stop migration from the EU. An awful lot of UK citizens live in the European Union. So what about the British expats living in the European Union? You've turned them rather into sort of negotiating counters,
not in the slightest. It's the Commission that is doing that.
Well,
the
both
British
sides
government,
of negotiation will blame each other.
No, Theresa May's government has made clear that they want to preserve the rights of EU citizens working in this country in terms of access to public services and so on. All the EU need to say is, right, the same applies to British citizens resident in the EU. Everyone's agreed.
And have the EU said that?
No.
So what negotiating position do you take in order to make them say that? Presumably Mrs May can then say, or Bulldog Brexit Davis can say, EU citizens won't have the same rights unless you give UK citizens the rights in Europe.
Well, exactly. It's got to be a reciprocal arrangement.
But in your understanding, is that how the negotiation is going on that?
I'm obviously not privy to the negotiations, but it seems clear to me that we have offered the same rights to EU citizens who are currently legally resident in the UK. I can't see any problem at all in the EU countries saying the same will apply to British citizens over there. I can't for the life of me see a problem. And to be perfectly honest, if that results in David Davis walking away, fine.
You're walking away from the European Union rather than walking away from the cabinet.
Yes.
You mentioned that £20 billion bill, and that's certainly not a final number, but let's use that to speculate on almost. I remember very clearly the referendum campaign being told how much money would be coming back to the UK, or rather no longer leaving the UK. As a result of Brexit, how much less tax am I going to pay?
As a result of Brexit, well, that's not going to depend just on Brexit. Brexit will be just one component in next year's or the year after's budget, won't it? The reality is, and this keeps cropping up, and Boris Johnson has quite rightly reminded people about it in the last week or two, the much quoted 350 million
per week.
And there is some dispute about net and gross figures, and some say the net figure is 276 million.
And the agreement and the rebate.
Yeah. And whether it's 276 million or 350 million, it is money that would be very well spent on a whole host of services in the UK. And when we leave and that money becomes available, the UK government could decide whether it wants it to spend it on the health service or more better transport, roads or whatever.
When am I going to notice it, though? When am I going to notice how much richer
you won't notice
I am?
You won't notice it until you leave. Until we leave, will we?
Well, but how in Cleethorpes and Immingham? How are the good people in Cleethorpes and Immingham? Suddenly the bus is going to be faster, the hospitals prettier.
Nothing will change on day one, whether we reach an agreement or not. Hopefully, we'll reach an agreement on borders and so on, and how we're handling imports and exports. We've got the largest port in the UK in Immingham. We don't want to see anything that will hamper that trade, but most of that trade isn't actually with the EU, and the opportunities exist for businesses and for ABP who operate the port and so on to look much wider than the sort of narrow prism of the EU, which we've been far too focused on for the last 40 years. The growing economies are not in the EU. They're in Asia, in South America and elsewhere.
The growing economies are growing faster than the EU economies, but they're still much, much smaller than the European economy. The European economy has been a developed economy since the Renaissance, and the growing economies have been growing since only in the last 30 years or so.
Some of the EU economies have been, highly developed economies such as our own and in France and Germany and so on. Others are struggling to keep up. And others are struggling to keep up thanks to the EU.
Well, let's not be rude enough to name names in that case. Let's return a little bit closer to home to Cleethorpes and Immingham. The idea of regional devolution seems to be dying at the moment in Yorkshire for when the councillors simply can't agree sufficiently to say, yes, please, we'd like these billions of pounds of investment from central government. Is the idea dead in Lincolnshire and Humberside as well?
Sadly, I think it is. Unfortunately, There was no unity amongst all the authorities, although it has to be said that both North and North East Lincolnshire were very much in favour of it. One Labour-led, the other Conservative-led.
It was Lincolnshire County Council.
It was the Lincolnshire County Council, who with a number of our MPs who were also opposed to it, who thwarted the deal, which now...
Your Conservative MPs?
Yeah, well, certainly one or two of them were Conservatives, but not all. Unfortunately, that means that the money that came with the devolution deal, which from memory was 30 billion over 20 years or whatever, is now not on the table. And we have been told in negotiations with the government that we should have taken that deal. We've now got to look at other sources of funding, such as the Coastal Communities Fund and the like, which we do very well out of, but not as well as we would have done with the devolution deal. And I'm afraid those politicians who thwarted the deal have got a lot to answer for.
Can we not go back to central government and say we're frightfully sorry, we're going to get rid of the people in Lincolnshire, whenever the next elections are? When you've changed the complexion, is there no hope at all? Is there no hope going back?
Well, the reality is the government, we're just one of many other devolution deals that are being negotiated. Others will overtake us. We had a chance to be in there in the first wave, which actually carried more resources with it than the second wave. And we've put ourselves at the bottom of the table now.
Martin, on that rather depressing note, enjoy the party conference this week. I hope you have a splendid time. I think we're all very interested to see what Mrs May has to say. Thank you very much for coming in, as ever.
Thank you.
Join me again next week for another Hot Topic.